Welcome one, welcome all to the Odd-Sided Dice podcast. The podcast that follows two 40 plus something gamers as we try to make sense of the literal thousands of games of choice that we have available to us now in the wargaming industry that we never had available to us back when we were getting into this hobby. We're going to, during this series of podcasts as we move forward, we're going to have a look at some new games, going to have a look at some old games, bring something off the shelf that maybe you weren't around for first time, and then we can revisit those stories and those moments that we all love from this wargaming hobby. In this episode, it's going to be slightly different from what we normally do. It's myself and Ian, my co-host, and we're together, and sometimes with a guest. The problem with this episode was that due to some family issues, due to some technical issues, it was quite hard to get all of us into the same room at the same time to be able to record the podcast. So rather than delay it and put the episode back a little bit, Ian has taken over the interview with our guest for this episode, which will be coming up in a few moments. So just to make sure that I get my face on this podcast for this episode, just thought I'd do a little introduction and say hello to everyone and explain what the situation was. Now, one of the other things I'd like to do at this point is, just before we get into the main interview, is just to say a big thank you. Thank you for the support that you are giving us on this podcast. It's greatly appreciated to have any kind of kind words or any kind of interaction with people in the community, people we don't know, but even friends and family as well, who are giving us as much support and as much going forwards as we can. If you're new to the Odd-Sided Dice podcast, there are a number of ways in which you can help out and you can make us feel like we're doing a decent enough job. The first one is obviously the usual YouTube like and subscribe. We have the Facebook page that you can come along and join in on, not only to see stuff from us, but to share your own stories and share your own hobby work, etc., etc. And there's also myself and Ian's Instagram pages. Now, all the links are usual in the description underneath. So please follow those links, and it would be great to get to know you if we don't know you, or get you to come along and hopefully find something you enjoy from watching and listening to this podcast. Now, what we would say is that next month, hopefully, we're going to go back to a bit of normality with myself and Ian in the same room. Not in the same room, in the virtually same room, to be able to carry out this podcast that we've been doing going forwards. We've got a number of top guests lined up for the last 3 months of the year, so hopefully don't miss out on any of those. Hopefully there's going to be a bit of a reveal for one. There's also going to be the announcement of something we've been working alongside a multi-award-winning miniature artist with, to allow someone out there to get a one-of-a-kind piece of miniature artwork to adorn your shelves. So make sure you have to stay around to hear the announcement of that. So again, it's just worth a little subscribe and a little like button so we can follow up on that. So again, this is going to be me out to say thank you very much. So all I'm going to do is hand now seamlessly over to Ian.
Well, we've got Mr. Paul Eaglestone from Empress Miniatures with us today, which I'm very excited about. One of my favourite producers and models. Paul, thank you very much for coming on the show this evening. How are you doing?
I'm great, and it's a pleasure, and it's even better to be called Mr.
Oh, must be my age. Must be my age.
I feel like a teacher now. It's great. I've made it.
Oh, well, that's it. No, thank you very much for coming on. It's a big pleasure, big privilege for me. But so anyway, first things first. When we get people on, ask them if they can just give us a brief history of themselves within the hobby, and also, I mean, yes, it depends. A brief as possible, and obviously a little bit of a history of Empress, really, and how it came about and where we are with Empress at the minute. So away you go, sir.
From a personal perspective in wargaming, I suppose I'm the Airfix generation,
Yeah.
which came out the 60s and 70s, where Airfix started to produce lots and lots of 20mm figures that they just called toy figures, but lots of us kids never got out of the habit of buying them and then painting them and then wargaming with them. And we were, I suppose, information wasn't readily available in those days. I mean, the best place to get a book was a library. And I think my local library, which was big, only had one book on wargaming. And I kept that out for so long, I actually got a pretty rude letter from the library demanding I bring it back, which I did. And then when the person who borrowed it put it back, I had it for another 6 months, I got another rude letter. But you couldn't get information, but you had 1 or 2 war games magazines, very good war games magazines. But the guys who were very much the gods in the hobby, the Brigadier Peter Youngs, the Don Featherstones, and my favourite Charles Grant, were gentlemen who were basically retired. They'd all done service in World War II, and they were playing with toy soldiers. So it kind of made it incredibly respectable in a very strange way. And you kind of graduated, people like me, from playing with toy soldiers to suddenly rolling dice and doing a bit more. But it wasn't anywhere near as common and acceptable as it is now. And I can certainly remember my parents thinking I was a bit strange, because I like, so when are you going to pack this in? But just kept going with it. Did the university thing, lost it for a few years, came back, discovered wine, women and song and all that sort of business. And then sort of, I suppose, in my early 20s, rediscovered it and thought, actually, I still really enjoy this. It's fascinating. And so never really stopped. So when did I get into it? I never really stopped being into it. It just became more readily available. And as time went on, it did become more readily available. And you could do things. And the standard that you have nowadays is astronomical. I mean, it bears no relationship to when I was around. And my generation will discuss such interesting topics as where to buy banana oil, which most people of your generation have no idea what that is. And that was because if you used Airfix figures and you wanted to change an Airfix Roman centurion into an elephant or something equally bizarre, you use plasticine, but plasticine you can't really paint on. So you had to find something that would make the plasticine solid so you could paint on it. And this was banana oil. And this was featured in a magazine. And I never did discover where you bought the stuff. And I don't know anybody that ever did. But it became a standing joke for my sort of generation as banana oil, and people would start laughing. But that's how different it was to now.
Yeah, I'm in my late 40s now, and they're very sort of similar, sort of like maybe like the next generation from you. And like again, started with Airfix, mainly airplanes and tanks, that kind of thing. But I did the whole Games Workshop thing, and then again university, and then I did come back and I worked for Games Workshop for a bit, and then had a big hiatus. And it's only been the last 8 years I've really been back in. But even in the time from like the late 90s, early 2000s to sort of the mid 2015ish, that sort of time, the difference of like the volume of wargaming, figures and things like that, it's like I'd fallen asleep for 100 years and came back like, what's going on? So it's
and it's good. I think that is absolutely excellent. But I do think that in a way, many sort of younger, what does that mean, but gamers lose out on a lot of the stuff that we were doing. Is that modeling, not to any great degree, not that was that particularly good, but you did learn lots of crafts, and then you did do lots of other facets of the hobby. And of course, computers were something that you only ever saw in a spy movie. Nobody had access, and the internet didn't exist by a long way. So getting information on how to paint something was quite difficult. Magazines were important. If you wanted to paint a French Imperial Guard Grenadier, there was so much on it, it was incredible. If you wanted to paint something a little bit more obscure, it was very, very difficult. So we had to seriously research it. We had to go into it and look at it. Now you just Google it and it's all there.
I've got
and that's amazing. Yeah.
So that aside, so how did then, as I'm saying, Empress come about? I mean, obviously, your interest in loving the hobby, I presume, is what springboarded you in. Was it something, you quite often hear someone saying like, well, I wanted this range and nobody else did it. Is that the kind of thing, or was it something totally different?
Yeah, that's exactly how we got into it. It was 14 years ago-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And my regular Wednesday evening war games partner, Keith, came round and we would play various periods games and stuff like that. And we wanted to get into Vietnam War. It was something that we both had an interest in. And we sat there and we discussed it, and we looked at different ranges at that point. And we couldn't find anything we really liked. It didn't sort of grab us. And Christine, my wife, who's the director of Empress as well, sort of bought the coffee in one evening, listened to some of this, and made an interesting comment, which was, why don't you get the things made yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of looked at each other and said, really, going to let me spend this money? And she said, well, no, but you could sell it. And we sort of thought, oh, okay. So we mulled the idea over. And at that point, we contacted, because Keith had connections with him, Paul Higgs.
Mm-hmm.
And we went along to discuss, having gone through the whole Vietnam thing, discuss what we were going to do. And like all really good war gamers, we did a butterfly thing.
Yeah.
We discussed the Zulu War. And that's where we started. We started with the Zulu War and grew it from there.
So, I mean, that's it. I was going to say, like, I mean, if anyone doesn't know the Empress like website, and if you go onto it, it's a treasure trove. I love looking on there. It's always like my kind of something I'm going to come into later on, actually, but it's something that's just happened this week. But it's something you kind of go, my first protocol. I go, I'll have a look at Empress first. They're bound to do something similar, and then 9 times out of 10, I'll end up looking at something else and go, oh no, that is nice. But yeah, it is. it is like that. And again, you mentioned about Vietnam, and again, we're going to touch on the Vietnam a lot more later on. But for me, getting back into the hobby, and it was one of the things I've always been interested in, was the Vietnam War. And I'd sort of looked around, and there was a few sort of Vietnam ranges out there that I sort of, well, so, but didn't really sort of nail it for us until I saw the Empress stuff. Now, when you first did the Vietnam stuff, was it the French Indochina stuff was the first part of it, or was it
kind of
yeah.
what we did when we set it up, to sort of go backwards slightly,
mm-hmm.
which hopefully will explain the logic behind a lot of it. We had certain criteria that we sat down and we agreed to. One was to produce not just things that we wanted, but to produce things that were the best possible standard.
Yeah.
And that meant the best sculpting, the best manufacturing, the best customer services that we could do, bearing in mind we had day jobs, etc. at the time. So we pushed the parameters, and as time went on, we did push the parameters in how to mold things, because the molder that we use is probably one of the best in the world, based in Birmingham in the jewellery quarter, so could do lots of things. But we did models that people said, you can't, there's no way you can mold that. And we said, well, okay, we'll see. And we pushed their thinking to do stuff. And since then, a lot of other companies have sort of said, oh, okay. And of course, they also mold for other companies.
Yeah.
So that's kind of lost, sadly, but that's always going to happen. So we pushed the parameters in what we wanted to do, and that included all the ranges. I mean, my degree was in history, with a passion for military. So I was used to researching and things like this and going through stuff. And we wanted to make them as historically accurate as we could to get people to look correctly. We also wanted soldiers to look as if they felt comfortable in what they were doing in any pose, i.e., when they picked up a gun, they looked like they knew what they were doing with it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the figures that we kind of looked at looked as if they were somebody carrying a bit of 2x4 across a field.
Yeah.
And that's not what we wanted to do. So having set a lot of that criteria, we could then start to look at stuff and develop it and push it in that area. So And it's one of the reasons when you look on the website, you will not find many painted figures.
No.
That's quite a specific decision.
Mm-hmm.
We simply blackwash them, and that's because, to my mind, you can make a lead fishing weight look really good with a good paint job.
Yeah, it's the painter who's doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, we wanted the customers to see in the most simplistic form how good they were without any paint on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why they're simply washed. The other reason is we just can't keep up. So
yeah,
it's difficult to do.
No, as I'm saying, I mean, you mentioned Paul before, Paul Hicks, and I mean, and you like, and again, so I'm going back to something I just said there before. I couldn't quite find a range I really liked, and it was, you know, the US Marine stuff, which was again, I'd always, my love of the Vietnam War comes more from a sort of growing up in the 80s Vietnam War films and that kind of thing. It's sort of like the movie sort of history of the Vietnam War. I mean, I was probably in my early 20s before I realized that the Americans hadn't actually won the Vietnam War, you know, that kind of thing. But but it's always like, it's, you know, all the classic films and then TV shows like Call of Duty and that kind of thing. Sorry, Tour of Duty. Call of Duty is totally different. And just seeing Paul's figures, and I think the first figures I got were the Full Metal Jacket figures, and I just was like, and it's, I love the way Paul sculpts, and like you said, it's like everything looks, I know he uses a lot of photographs, doesn't he, to so it's like they're almost like taken from a real situation, aren't they?
Yeah, we when we set up, part of the trying to make figures or look like real people was very simple process. I mean, I've been involved in historical reenactment for 40 plus years, and have a collection of guns, not Vietnam period, I have to say. But so I was used to handling weapons, and what we used to do, Keith and myself, in those early days, and still to a degree do on certain of them, is we would model, invariably me, I would model the pose I wanted Paul to do.
Yeah.
So a lot of the early stuff in the Zulu War, some of the Spanish Civil War that we did, is me modelling with a gun.
Right, yeah.
And then we give it to Paul and then say, that's what we want the figure doing, and this is what he's wearing.
Yeah.
And so that's how we did it. Now, as time has gone on and we've got involved in more modern conflict, and it's not just Paul, I mean, our other figure sculptor is Tony Boosted, who does our modern range, the English Civil War range, and the new Hollywood cowboy range.
Yeah.
What we do with those, a lot of those, is they're actually based on photographs, because there's no logic in me trying to pretend I've got an M14 and running around the back garden. There's so many photographs that you can download online, and even film that you can then just snap off stills. And so every one of the figures in all those ranges is based on a photograph, which sometimes gets us into conversation because people go, well, there's no way someone would hold that RPG-7 like that. And we have to go, if we can be bothered, if I'm honest, there's the photograph of the VC doing it. And this guy knows what he's doing, you know.
Yeah. I mean that was the thing I was going to mention, was just like, is it easier to get sort of stock footage of the Americans or Allied sort of posers to the say like the NVA and the Viet Cong, because they probably weren't as filmed or photographed as much. But then the point you've just made there, yes, when you get a piece of film, you could potentially have like umpteen different poses in 1 2-second reel of film, haven't you? So
yeah, if you look at, for example, there's a lot of films of US Marines in Hawaii, and in a way that the poses are, to a certain degree, if you're not careful, quite unique to Hawaii, because they're in an urban environment. They're not crawling around a paddy field or something, and you have to take that into account. With the NVA and VC, for example, there's not as much film, but there is film, but it's predominantly propaganda based.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful, because they would tend to strike quite a heroic pose.
Yeah.
as opposed to sort of jumping behind a barricade or something. when somebody's shooting at them.
Mhm.
There's quite a lot of film, but in that instance, what may happen is I will know I will sit and I know what I want in that pack,
Mhm.
and I know what I want in that pack in relation to what I want in all the other packs, because ultimately that's building a unit, whether it's a section, a squad, a platoon, etc. So I will then look around, and you will find lots of stills of both.
Mhm.
But if necessary, I can either go back to the posing thing, which I haven't done on the Vietnam range, but you can find photographs, and it might be a photograph of an Asian, Japanese soldier. I mean, I didn't do this, but a Japanese soldier in World War II,
Mhm.
where there are a lot more photographs and a lot more film. Again, Asian, because you have to stick to that form of sort of ethnic race, because it does figure in a
Yeah,
big way.
I know you've kept the sizes quite realistic
Yeah,
as well, haven't you? Yeah.
yeah. I sat and researched all the average sizes for all of the people, and went through lots of the myths. I mean, there's this myth that weirdly seems to have developed that people from North Vietnam were a lot taller
Mhm.
than people from South Vietnam, and they weren't. I mean, it's just nonsense.
Mhm.
And mainly because in the years between when the French were beaten at the Dien Bien Phu and the Treaty of Paris was signed, and you had a form of peace between the North and South, the North swamped the South with, I can't think what it was, but it's well over 1 million, I think it was North Vietnamese, who were just sent south to infiltrate. And if they'd have been suddenly a foot taller than everybody in the South, everybody had gone, oh, he must be a VC or something. So it didn't happen, and you don't see that. You've only got to see pictures of prisoners, etc., to realise there is a very, very big difference, not just an average size difference. So yes, we did that. But you sort of go through that process, and you pick pictures like that, and then you give them to the sculptors again, and you can say, okay, I know he's a Japanese soldier. Bear in mind that all the sculptors we work with have pretty much been with us since day one. We've gained some, but we've not lost any. We're all the same crowd. So we're all well and truly well attuned to working with each other. So just, stuff's emailed, messaged, whatever it is, photographs, do this. I mean, I've just a few weeks back now, sent the next lot for the next load of Arvin, and I've just gone through them, picked stuff and made it relevant to Arvin paratroopers, what they're wearing. And some of the poses, it's literally a case of that's the pose, but that's what he's wearing, that's the weapon he's carrying, blah, blah. So we tweak what we do. But the underlying thing is it's accurate. Historically, it's accurate. It will look right, it will look correct, and they will look like they should do.
Yeah, yeah. No, they're a fantastic range. I love them. That's what I think
Thank you.
it was my lockdown project basically. It was sort of like I found them, and funny enough, it was like last summer, and I think everything I had on my desk was Paul's. It was like I had, because it was when all the Barons War stuff he did for Andy
Yeah,
did as well.
yeah, which is a lovely range.
Yeah.
I'm annoyed it's not ours, but it's a lovely range, and credit to them on that one.
Yeah, definitely. Now, actually, we've covered a couple of points there. We're going to talk about all the mashed into one, so I'm going to kind of go to the middle, the bit we missed out. But it was just a funny thing that came to my mind, and again, we kind of have touched a little bit on it, but talking about Vietnam ranges and also Vietnam rule sets. And again, the other thing I found is I've never really been able to find a rule set which I'm totally happy with. There's VC on the Trail, which is sort of an adaptation of bold action, and I always think that just feels a little bit too big and a bit too rigid. And what was the recent one was the Nam, the way it was, and again I like that, but that's almost the opposite side. It's a little bit too loose and a bit too free, and I was almost kind of like want to find it like sort of like the set that I really want to get a hold of. But one thing I always thought was, now it might just be a personal thing, but I'm kind of coming from a point going like, the Vietnam War is really popular. It seems to be in my generation. It might not be to a younger generation or an older generation, but I kind of think, have you got any insight to maybe wonder why because it seems to be there's a lot of people. You seem to be riding the crest of a new Vietnam wave that I feel is like kind of coming. There's other firms who are doing a lot of Vietnam stuff. I know Rubicon seems to be one of them, and obviously there's yourselves and Gringo 40 who have always done a lot. But I don't know, as I'm saying, I can't. It might just be a personal thing, but I just don't. What is it? I know I've got friends who quite don't like the idea of modern war gaming, and that, you know, you're potentially fighting with could be somebody's relative. And that, I mean, that's never really bothered me, but I think because of the Vietnam side of thing, I always think of it more of a film thing. But I don't know. It's a bit of a ramble. I don't know if you got any insight up, Paul.
I think it's a mix of all of that. If you take, well, if somebody says to me modern warfare, again, old school, I think of anything that is post 1945 because that's what used to be the tag. I think that's changed now. I mean, when we did the modern range, the ultra modern range, we called it ultra modern.
Yeah.
We were the guys who used the sort of color green, which represented night sights and things that's become fairly standard now. And we did it incredibly tentatively. We really felt, oh dear, we could really put our foot in it here. And I would say the biggest is probably our largest selling range, strangely, and the biggest group of customers within that grouping were either serving military or ex-military who'd gone through Afghanistan and Iraq. We had information from special forces from around the world. SAS and SBS were great. I mean, it was quite strange suddenly be getting emails from members of them who were serving and on operational duties saying, oh, have you ever thought about this? And here's some pictures. We had similar things from American special forces, some European. We even had help from, at one point, through a connection and a customer, the Russian government, when we did our Russian ones. So when you get to working in that area, you start to think, and I know there's a lot of people that think it's perhaps not greatly moral to do it when people are actually out there dying. But when I've got customers who are actually sitting there playing with toy soldiers 1 minute and then grabbing the gun and going out and doing it, I think anything I think is irrelevant.
Yeah.
If they're happy, I'm happy.
Well,
and I don't disrespect anybody that doesn't want to do it, that's fine. If you go to Vietnam, which in my little world is modern, I think actually what's got people interested is not they don't want to get involved in the ultra modern stuff. I actually think it's actually works the other way. I think they've come out of World War II and are moving into the 60s, because to me that's modern, but to them it's not.
Yeah. And
I often sit and think, hang on, when I was a kid watching all these really bad American war films like Battle of the Bulge, which has got much to do with history as God knows what. There were a lot of veterans in the audience in those cinemas watching that who'd been there.
Yeah.
And you think, wow, it was that close, because it was not that many years after. So I think the Vietnam thing, it's more to do with that. I think it's moved from World War II. We did it because we were just interested. I mean, Keith was younger at that point. I mean, Keith's not involved with the business anymore as such, although we're still connected. But I was younger than Keith by about 12, 13, 14 years or something. I'd grown up on the television watching it on the news. And so when they were all trying to jump onto a helicopter in Saigon on the top of the US Embassy, I sat there glued to the news, as did my parents, thinking, oh my God. A lot of the film you now see, it was on the 9 o'clock news. It was there in front of you. So I grew from that. Then it disappeared. The Americans walked away from it in a huge way, and totally understandably. It's probably scarred them as much as the American Civil War did in their history. But Hollywood reinvented it in a big way. And of course, the Rambo fantasy stuff really grabbed their imagination. And Hollywood sort of did put it across that, in effect, as horrible as it had been, they actually really came out of this quite well. Yeah. Which is partly true. They didn't come out too horrendously badly, but they didn't win. They walked away from it. Because they were never going to win. I mean, what they didn't seem to understand is that however much technology they had, the VC were never going to lose. And even though they got quite close to it just before the Tet, or during the Tet offensive, they were never going to lose, because the worst thing that could ever happen, they'll go home for a few years, sort themselves out, come back again. But I think when we started the Vietnam range, it was a scratch that needed or an itch that needed scratching. And having meant to do it all those years ago. It was a case of, I better get on and do this. So did it. There were some good books that came out at the time, and that was the plan. So we just started sculpting and do it. There were other companies who had done ranges, all very good. But I wanted to push the range, and the range will in the end be quite extensive.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say it's a big range, as in it's still a niche period.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare, because bearing in mind we're in a commercial business, if you compare it with something like Napoleonic, World War II, it's a niche. It's
Mm-hmm.
quite small. If we'd have actually spent the sculpting time doing, let's face it, 1944 period SS,
Mm-hmm.
we would have sold huge volumes.
Yeah.
Because that's where there is a huge marketplace. Vietnam is just almost like one little campaign within that area.
Yeah.
But that's not how Empress works. Although we have to be obviously commercial and logical,
Mm-hmm.
we do things that we want to do. We do things that we think are right, and a lot of the time they become commercial. And we've got a very good loyal customer base who picks up on it. So a lot of people have got into it. When it comes to rules, you're right. There are loads out there. There's some very good ones, such as FNG. I think there's a second version of that one, which are quite good. So there's lots and lots of rules out there, but there's no dominant set of rules.
No. As I'm saying, it's like, I mean, I suppose I mentioned like VC on the trail using bolt action, but it's not an official bolt action supplement, is it? So, but talking of rules, I believe Empress are producing their own rules for Vietnam. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're doing it with at the moment. We're just going through the processes, but we're working with Caliber Books, Dave Ryan,
Mm-hmm.
because he's an old friend going back through reenactment for decades. And it's a development of a rule set that we own, which is called Danger Close.
Yeah.
Which is really for modern rules. And it's a very simplistic set. The infantry part of it is quite literally two sides of A4.
Mm-hmm.
And we found playing ultra modern games is we wanted to play games. We didn't want to sit there searching for something to happen on page 147.
Yeah.
So we snapped that up and worked with it. And over the years, we gradually ended up playing games, myself and the other guys I played with, where we knew the rules well enough that we could just make it up as we went along.
Mm-hmm.
And then we sort of said, hang on, we should actually develop these things. So I sat down, and having done the Vietnam side, and when you're researching, you read so much, you absorb so much, that when you do pick up any set of rules, however good they are, you start to look for the things that you read, and you can't replicate it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get that atmosphere. So I suddenly thought, well, I might as well use all this information I've absorbed and develop the rules and see what happens. So they're developed. So 2 pages has now become at the moment something like 60.
Mm-hmm.
But that includes some scenarios to help you play it at the back and things like that. So they're called Bohica, which is an American military term at the period for bend over, here it comes again.
Ah, right. I hadn't heard that one.
And the logic behind that one really is that's pretty much what I was trying to get across in the rules. You know, whether you're playing North Vietnamese, VC, MVA, or you're playing Australians, ARV, and whatever it is, it's not easy for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And it quite literally out of nowhere, something can happen. That doesn't mean they're not controlled. It's not a controlled environment. It pretty much is.
Mm-hmm.
But it does put a lot of stress and pressures on you when you're playing the game.
Oh, sounds good. As I say, that's I hadn't presumed, but I thought it might be based around the Danger Close rules. But yeah, it's that's something I'm really. So any idea, sort of, as I'm saying, is it still a little way off before?
Well, we were hoping to try and get it out before Christmas, but running out of time. And the problem is that with COVID and a few other things, everything's a lot slower than it normally is.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine, having just done the final rewrite, I'll spend some more time tomorrow in between everything else and just add some information and bits and pieces and that, and then sort out some charts. and then probably submit it to then be laid out, which is quite a long process.
Yeah.
I would say in the next week or two. Then it's all going to be laid out. I've got to do lots of photographs, a lot of them based on explanations for the rules, you know, line of sight and all this sort of business, and also fun pictures. So it's really then how long, once that all happens, if I'm honest, I think it's sliding now into the early part of next year. And I'll be really honest, I'd rather do it properly than rush it.
Rush it out, yeah, definitely, yeah. So, no.
You know, I'm not a great fan of, because these, in this day and age, they cost, a set of rules cost a lot of money. And I know, having said this, there's going to be a typo somewhere, or something people just don't understand, or whatever it is. That's by the nature of it. Been doing loads of play testing, had a play test group on it. There's been loads of work on that side, and they've picked up some great stuff. We've changed it, tweaked it, and even in doing the rewrite, I've tweaked some bits and pieces. But I'd rather get it as good as I can, because I know I'm going to get people having to go anyway. So I might as well cut the numbers down.
Well, it saves you as well. I mean, it seems to be a bit of a culture of sort of like rules getting produced, and then within a week the first FAQ comes out, and it's almost like, oh well, if we get something wrong, the FAQ will cover it up. But it's almost counterintuitive, isn't it, if you do it right in the first place? So
well, it kind of is, and stuff will get through because it's the nature of the game. But I just think that's lazy, slack. We're not chasing the buck. We're not trying. We must get it out for Christmas because we'll sell twice as many as we will do if we send it out in February. If I'm really honest, and Dave, who's going to be printing all this, will probably kill me for saying this, I'd rather it was as good as we can get it.
Yeah.
Because I want it sitting on someone's shelf, and I want them looking at it and reading it and understanding it and playing it and enjoying it. Yeah. If it's not their style, it's not their style, because it won't be like bolt action. Predominantly, it's very specific to the Vietnam War. It can be moved very easily into French Indochina. The plan is to, after this, if it actually sells and everybody's interested, that there'll be scenario books, and the scenario books will push it into French Indochina a bit more and other areas. And there'll be rule sections unique to some of the scenarios. So there'll be details on French Indochina, which was more of a World War II engagement. With the North Vietnamese. So I'd much rather do that, and I'd much rather do it properly than, as I said, just rush it, get it out there and go, whoopee, ka-ching, money.
Exactly.
It's just not what Empress does. It's not our style.
No. As I'm saying, I'm personally very excited for it. As I'm saying, I'm a big fan of everything that Empress does, and their new set of rules again for one of my favorite like historical periods. I'm very much looking forward to. So I touched on before, I mean, very quickly, because we're probably all running out of time, but I mentioned about how delving into like looking at Empress's back catalogue when something pops into my mind and getting a bit sort of sidetracked. And I've been listening to, I don't know if you ever listened to the We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast with Al Murray. Predominantly Second World War, but they touched on a bit of Spanish Civil War, but it was more about Spanish soldiers fighting for the British in the Second World War. But it made us think about the Spanish Civil War, and it's always something that I'd always liked the idea of from being really young, thinking about, I remember seeing a picture of Messi Schmidt as in a, the Condor Legion sort of colours and that kind of thing, and sort of asked my dad, well, what's that all about? But something I've never really looked into that much. And again, it was like, I'll have a look at Empress. I'm sure they do something. I've obviously seen it before, and I'm looking, oh yeah, they're nice, but I don't know that much. And I was thinking to myself, I'm sure Osprey do a set of rules that not necessarily covers. It's not necessarily Spanish Civil War, but kind of covers all that interwar stuff. Went on Amazon. There it is. There, is it the World in Flame?
A World of Flame.
A World of Flame. Yeah. And I without looking, I went, that's it there. Whatever it is on Amazon, $8.99, something like that. Buy, correct. And it says about the author Paul Eaglestone. I went, well, that's a coincidence. So, that was quite a while ago, wasn't it, Paul?
Yeah, I think it was the first or second one. Yeah, that's it. I
Yeah.
love the cover. I think it's one of the
Yeah.
best covers. Um, I think it was about the first or second one that they ever published, and
Yeah.
they started up doing the range. And it's a good illustration. What I was talking about earlier about trying to get it right, is that I learned a lot from that,
Hmm.
because one of the big constraints was physical size,
Yeah.
and the rules had been written, and I knew the guy, because Osprey's not far from here.
Hmm.
I knew the editors, etc., and they said, "Well, we're doing this," and the rules were originally written for British Civil War.
Yeah.
And that was, wow, that's got to be 12 years, 13, something like that. We just started up at Empress. So I kind of adapted them to make them more interwar.
Hmm.
And I think they came out at about twice as long,
Yeah.
with all the information and the scenarios and everything else, than they got published, because they had so much constraints. And when it came out, if I'm really honest, I've never been, we still use them,
Hmm.
but they could have been better, but they got kind of cut down and hacked, and I learned a lot of lessons from it. And I'm not moaning about Osprey. I learned a lot as well. They do work extremely well. We still use them, and we use them a lot, and we have great fun. And weirdly enough, before the Bohica thing started, one of the plans was to actually redo them
All right.
again
Uh-huh.
privately, and actually do them how I wanted them doing, but link them into interwar, but more on the Jazz Age imperialism side, the 1920s, 30s
Yeah.
colonial warfare and things.
Oh no.
Um,
I mean, the funny thing is, just talking about the layout and stuff like that, you can see it's an earlier one, because they've seemed to have crammed a lot more into it than you do, say, a modern one. And I know everyone says you've only got this, what is it, 60 odd pages, haven't you? Something along them lines.
well, you haven't got, it's minuscule. And by the time they load them up with pictures, which look pretty,
Yeah.
you lose huge amounts of wording.
Yeah.
So it was a shame. And there were, in that, I think I had 2 or 3, probably more, scenarios which were going to be produced to illustrate how to play it,
Hmm.
because they all got lost apart from one of them.
Yeah.
So it lost a lot of explanation. And also in those days, well, I think probably still now, is that Osprey publish and then rely on the authors to do all the backup marketing and stuff.
Yeah.
And I just didn't have the time. I had a day job. We'd set up Empress, then this came along, and it was a case of, I just sadly don't have time to do this with everything else in my life.
Mm.
So I couldn't give it as much personal backup as I wanted. That won't happen with Bohica, because of life's totally different now, so we'll be able to do it. So yeah, weirdly enough, that was another one I did.
Oh, well, that's it. I mean, I think I'll be because I know you're the finally the show season's just around the corner finally after 18 months. So my the big one, my big trip with the boys is always down because I'm up in the northeast. So it's a big trip down to Salute. And I think it was on Facebook, was it yesterday today, you were saying about his basics. I think I might be pick up some more Vietnam stuff off you, but I might be picking up some Spanish chaps as well.
It's a very interesting conflict. I mean, it's very Civil War, but for real.
Yeah.
And it's quite gruesome, but then Civil Wars are.
Yeah.
And in many respects, and historians have started to argue the case, it's the beginning of World War II.
Yeah.
They just didn't quite realise it at the time.
Yeah, definitely. The western part of it,
yeah. Yeah, but it's quite savage. And of course, it then goes on for decades after, because Franco wins.
Yeah.
So
that's it. No. Oh well, no, it's all good stuff. So, I'm looking out for Bohica, and as I'm saying, I'm looking forward to doing a bit of Spanish Civil War. Or I dare say, by Salute comes around, I might have had another look on the Empress website and then decided on something else. I've got my eye on some cowboys actually. So
the cowboys are great fun, to be honest, because again, that's a Western range from a film perspective, and I'm probably showing my age because of the characters I'm picking, but that's been fascinating, because once you start to look at John Wayne, you discover so many things. Like he was 6'2" to 6'4", depending on where you get your information. But he actually carried, in all the guns, he carried reduced size weapons to make himself look bigger. So the pistol he carries, invariably a Colt revolver, is a cut down version, and the Winchester is actually a woman's Winchester,
to make him,
and it was all to make him look big.
God, it's like Tom Cruise in the trenches, isn't it?
Yeah. And so when you well, you get again Alan Ladd, who was in the famous Shane film, as an actor, looked fantastic, but he was very short. I'm not sure how tall he was, but he was very short. I think 5'6", but short for a leading man.
Yeah.
And so when they did a lot of filming in buildings, and he was next to other men, they used to literally dig trenches in the floor, so the other actors would walk through the trenches and he'd walk on the floor.
Oh, fascinating, isn't it?
So when we're designing the figures, we're having to look at it and make a decision as to, if we do Alan Ladd, do we make Alan Ladd look as big as he does in the films, or do Alan Ladd the actor's height, which means he's quite short?
Well, you could do a double pack, couldn't you? You could do one with Cuban heels and one without.
And you find things like Lee Marvin, who shot Liberty Valance. Lee Marvin actually wears his gun belt backwards.
All right.
If you look at his gun belt, he wears it completely backwards.
So
and weirdly enough, by pure fluke, I discovered him playing a character in another film, and he did exactly the same thing. And the film was made, I think, about 2 years before. So I think he liked it, enjoyed the difference. Somebody must have commented, that looks good, and used it for the part of Liberty Valance, which is a superb piece of acting. But his whole gun rig, he's on backwards, completely on backwards, back to front, the whole thing.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Hey, well, we could talk all night about this, and as I'm saying, unfortunately, we're on Zoom, so we've only got 40 minutes, so we're gonna have to leave that. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Paul. Obviously, do you want to give us a bit of, like, you know, where can we find Empress on the World Wide Web and all that kind of thing?
Well, just Google Empress Miniatures and you'll pick up and go straight to the site. There's a Facebook page as well, so look up Empress Miniatures, and that's got all the day-to-day chats and releases, and there's quite a lot of releases going on across lots and lots of periods, and that's not planning on stopping anytime soon. So have a look on there. But no, thanks very much for inviting me on for a chat. It's been great fun. It's nice to meet you. Hopefully I'll meet you at Salute.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And just stay tuned for the rules and see what happens. And hopefully, if you buy a copy, you'll enjoy them. And if you don't, you know where to get me and ask some questions.
Well, as I'm saying, I'll be pushing it on. We've got the Odd Side of Dice Facebook page, so I'll be no doubt pushing it on there as well. But Paul, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, mate.
Look after yourself.
You too.
Bye.
Cheers, mate. Cheers.